Glad to see so many of you here for this celebration of the fantastic book by our wonderful colleague, Rachel Barkow. I'm Trevor, I'm the dean. It's my job just to welcome you all, to say thank you for joining us, and to thank our two guests here as well. There are many things that have already been said in glowing terms about this book, some of them written on the very back, like the following. Rachel Barkow powerfully argues that the only way to end mass incarceration is to transform how criminal law is made. Instead of fear-driven anecdotes and popular politics, we need law based on reliable data, experts, agencies, constrained prosecutors, and judges who were once public defenders. If you care, as I do, this person says, about disrupting the perverse politics of criminal justice, there's no better place to start than prisoners of politics. And it just so happens that that was James Forman who said that. And he's here to say more along those lines. Something else that is said about this book on its back is that Rachel is one of the country's smartest thinkers on criminal justice, and in her new book, she makes a cogent and provocative argument about how to achieve true institutional reform and fix our broken system, and that was said by Emily Bazelon, our other commentating guest here. So we have experts from the world of academia and journalism, and we are grateful to both of them for joining us, and I will turn things over to this group, which I think is going to proceed in a kind of conversation format for the session. So thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming. It's such a pleasure and honor to be here for the launch of Rachel's excellent book, and especially to be here also with James. These are two of my favorite people to talk with about criminal justice issues, so this just feels like a big treat to me. And I'm glad you're all here to enjoy it with me. So we just sprung on Rachel that we've changed the format and are going to include her from the beginning in the conversation. And she was joking, this is what you get when you invite a journalist who cannot, this is my part, you can't handle like long presentations. We don't do that. So we're just going to go conversation route. And we're going to, I think, organize this in terms of 4 themes from the book. Okay. This is news to Rachel. Yep.
So you think you invite your blurbers so they'll say nice things, and then they do something like this.
They say nice things, but then they impromptu mess everything up for you. So we're going to start by talking about experts and the role that Rachel thinks that they play in reforming the criminal justice system. Then we're going to talk about social movements and prosecutors and judges. And I'm going to kick things off on our expert section. So one of the observations you make in the beginning of the book, which I was really intrigued by and have been thinking about, is that in managing problems of public health and the environment, we do have a system in the United States in which we mostly defer to agency expertise, right? We have the EPA, we have state environmental agencies, and we basically have an expectation that the technocrats are going to figure out policy for us. The legislature has done a lot of deferring to agencies in a way that is really not true nearly as much in the criminal justice realm. So I would love to hear your thoughts about why, and to set the table with a few of my own. It seems to me that the politics are different, that this is a kind of legacy of the rise in crime in the 60s and 70s and the Nixonian turn to law and order rhetoric, which has been such a powerful political force, and that has just sort of set the table in a different way. And then the other thing that really intrigued me that I wanted to focus on are your examples of state criminal justice commissions and agencies, a variety of kind that you powerfully describe and show are really able to take criminal justice debates and view them and make policy much more through the realm of cost-benefit analysis, not just like, is this prison efficient, but is this the way we want to be spending our state budget overall? Are we really better off spending X percent on prisons and jails and incarceration versus schools and clean water, et cetera? So it injects a kind of cost-benefit overall analysis and also just sort of an element of rationality. The kind of, I think, technocratic expertise that you are looking for. And yet, in the federal system, that I think has been harder to come by. And you couldn't talk obviously about the Sentencing Commission and also the role of the Department of Justice, which I think you really powerfully show has not been any kind of agent in reform, and in which I think you really see as an impediment to reform, and yet standing in this really important role in the federal system where it's kind of looked to for expertise. So that's what I wanted to start out with. Do you want to should we let Rachel speak? We'll let you.
Okay, all right. So the very first thing I have to say before I answer your question is a huge thanks to both of you for being here, and thank you all so much for coming. This is a really nerve-wracking experience that does not exist for law review articles, that you just write and they go out into the world and no one cares and there's no event and you just kind of wait and see what happens. But this is a much bigger deal, and it means so much to me to see you all here. So it's very, very nice. It's like a wedding for my book. So thank you for that. So now with this new format that we have, this is fun, and I will try to answer that first question. So it is true that the book makes the case that why is criminal law different from so many other areas of public policy development, in that we don't take the best data available, we don't use the best information out there. Why wouldn't we? And I think that is the way to ask the question, and yet whenever I've presented this idea to prosecutors, when I first became a law professor, one of my very first papers was basically making that claim, and I remember in a room of prosecutors where they were like, what? They helped me practice, and they said, well, that's not what we do. That's not what we do, and we have discretion because we pursue justice. And I think it does get to the answer to your question, which is this idea of seeing criminal law as occupying a space of moral justice and case-by-case discretion and not really thinking of it as making policy. I think that's false. I think that's not what happens in criminal law. And I think, to pull in James's book here, there's this idea that, yes, it's lots of individual actors in different spaces and time making decisions, but together that is our criminal justice policy. So the idea that we wouldn't have an overarching way of thinking about it, to me, seems unwise. But I do think it stems one, from that fact that it's not traditionally been seen that way. It's been more of a kind of morality judgment as opposed to policy. The second would be the political point that you made. That is, there's not a big incentive to get rid of this policy space to experts like there is in other areas where politicians are kind of happy. Oh gosh, we're going to make someone unhappy with our decision. We might make labor unhappy on the one hand or management on the other. Hey, we'll create an agency that's responsible for labor relations, and then we'll blame them when the policy is created and it's not very good. That's not true in criminal law because they can make all the key constituents they want happy by just passing ever harsher laws. So they haven't really wanted to delegate that off to other actors in the system, unless there's some other competing pressure that would make them want to do it, like they're running out of money and they need to kind of rein something like that in. There hasn't been that same political push to do it. So I think that is the main reasons why it hasn't come out the same way. It's true in the states too, although we have some examples from states that do a little bit better job using experts to help them set some of their policies. In particular, for sentencing policy, we have states that have some sentencing commissions that are by law required to not have sentences go beyond their current prison capacity. That is not what the federal system was set up to do, unfortunately. So it means you can kind of keep filling federal prisons as much as you want. There's no cap. But for the states that have the cap, that's actually been a really huge and beneficial rationalizing force. And so that would be an example where there were political forces that states were running out of money. They didn't want to raise taxes, and they didn't want to spend all their money on criminal justice. And so they created sentencing commissions to help them spend less. And then they put in these prison caps. So that's an example of where political forces could maybe push toward this kind of creation. And then once they do, they're actually very, very helpful. The Sentencing Commission at the federal level, as I said, doesn't have that. It has lots of other flaws that I can now talk about freely because I'm no longer on there. It has some really good things about it too, but that is a problem, and it's made it so that when people have looked at the Federal Sentencing Commission, they've kind of thought, oh gosh, an expert model, that's terrible. We would never want that in criminal law. Look at the Federal Sentencing Commission, and my hope is that people will look more carefully and say, well, maybe it just was designed poorly, but the idea of having an expert that actually looks at data and evidence, that's a good idea. It just was set up, frankly, to fail from the outset for a variety of reasons. One is lacking that prison cap. The other is who's on it. It's always had a majority of former prosecutors at any one time on the Sentencing Commission. It does not have a defender representative on there. It's kind of set up to really do what DOJ asked for given the politics. And most importantly, Congress has stepped in before the Sentencing Commission has been able, frankly, to do most of its job by just passing laws without caring. And so that model of expertise, unfortunately, I think has given expertise a bad rap. And it's really a bad time to be arguing for expertise anyway, I feel, in the United States today, like standing up for science and rationality and facts and data. Making that argument at a time when it's under attack across the board may be a really uphill climb for criminal law, but we get better policies when we do that, and I do think spaces where it happens shows that.
I was going to ask a shift a little bit to this question of social movements, but do you want to ask a follow-up on the expertise? Okay.
See how nice they are.
So it's a great book, and I appreciate you writing it, and you can see, I mean, it's one of these books where you see a person's kind of life's work, making it into and you just said, when you reference one of your first articles, I feel like this book, in a way, it kind of does that. It brings together so many of the things that you've been writing about, and some of us do read law review articles, and we read your law review articles, but this, I think, is putting it in a form and in a way that'll reach a broader audience, and we're grateful for that. So when you were talking about expertise just now, right? There's experts as wise, and there's experts as insulated from politics, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of social movements in creating the criminal legal system that we have, and also in this moment of reform that we are somewhat in, because so as I understand your argument, you're saying, okay, if we're going to have this sort of popular democratic pushback, let's make sure that one of the claims that this movement has is not just changing personnel, but changing institutions and changing structures, because that is the kind of change that will outlast the fervor of the movement itself. So I take it, or at least and I want to know, or so one question I have is kind of do I have that right as a way of understanding your thinking? But I guess the other question that I have is, there's a way in which, I talked about the book being a life's work, and there's a way in which it feels like the ground is shifting very fast on this precise question, and it's almost like you can see it in the page where you have a critique of popular politics, and then you're confronted by the fact that right here, right now, it seems like the strongest pushback that we have at this moment as we sit here now against the system that has been built is a popular movement, is a series of popular movements, it seems to me that that's the, as I read the story, that's the strongest force. And so I guess I'm wondering, it feels like you're of two minds on this question of insulated experts versus popular democracy. And I guess I wonder whether you shouldn't this current moment that we're in shouldn't give you and us a little bit more faith in the ability of people through movements through elections and otherwise, launch an effective counterattack to mass incarceration.
Okay, so it's a great question, and I'm glad you asked, because there is this tension. So first of all, if I were to get anything out of this book, it would require there to be a political push for it. So the irony is that I'm saying that we need to change our institutional structures, but how do institutional structures get changed? They have to get changed by people pushing for those changes. So one of the things that I hope to do is to tell everyone who's interested in criminal justice reform, what should you ask for? You know you're angry about mass incarceration in the abstract, or you're angry about a particular case of injustice that you read about. So what do you want? And what I don't want that energy channel to is the kind of reforms that we're seeing so far, which really are very minor. They are the kinds of things that are targeting nonviolence. They're really getting minor offenses. We're chipping away, frankly, at things that are the easiest cases around. And so the movement so far is yielding results, which I applaud. But I would like to see, to the extent there is now this push, because I agree with you, it's there, and it's necessary for anything I want, but to channel it into the places where it would be most productive, which to me are these institutional shifts that we would want to put in place, so then the movement will go on. Because here's the problem. For every time you read about, the criminal justice reform movement passed a law that is lowering the dollar amount for felony theft, or is changing the way to think about a particular drug, I guarantee you that same day, if you look around, you will find another law that was recently passed that increased the penalties for opioids, or is going to see somebody prosecuted for the death of a fellow addict that they gave drugs to. So the news right now is mixed, and I think it will continue to be like that if all the political movements do is kind of say, well, we want different substantive laws, lower this sentence or change this law. And what I would rather see is to channel all that energy to say, wait, why are you making those direct decisions? That's crazy, because it's really us. And you kind of have to ask yourself, are the people writ large really in the best position to decide what policies yield the most public safety outcomes? And what I try to do in the first part of the book is explain what might be intuitive senses of what would produce public safety, but in fact are just the opposite. And and both of you do this in your books as well, this idea, we have various things like pretrial detention. You might think, oh, that's a good idea. Let's lock people up so they can't come out and commit further offenses, when in fact that actually produces more crime, because you're taking people out of stable environments. They might lose their job. And there's a whole bunch of areas like that. But we get policies that do that because we lead them in this political process that's kind of destined to keep replicating in that. So my hope would be to say, okay, yes, there are people kind of concerned with how things work, but ask yourself, why do they work that way? How did we get these policies in the first place? And once you kind of go into that, I'm hoping that you'll see that what we should be thinking about would be these institutional reforms. Let's rethink how we measure a successful prosecutor. Let's put in place agencies that think about things like costs and data. Let's change who's on the bench and how we litigate cases and what issues are important, because those are kind of the bigger structural changes that I think will lead to more lasting reforms. Because my worry is if we kind of keep chipping away, there's those reports that say things like, if we wanted to reduce the prison population by 50%, that's not going to happen in my lifetime. And what I would hope is that we could get results faster by moving for institutions. But I do want to say that none of this happens without people caring about it. So the kind of number one thing that has to happen is for people to care enough to want to see the change. Now, I leave that to other experts, because I'm not a social movement expert, and how to get people to care. But the good news for me is people have done that. People like you, people like Brian Stevenson. So now when people start to care, I hope I can come in with the wonky ideas that, oh, this is great that you care, but maybe ask for some of these things. And one thing that I do think is positive is this idea with this newfound attention to prosecutors and how important they are in the system. That's a good example of that. Like, don't just think about how did you prosecute one case, but what should your policies overall in an office be? The kind of things that Emily has in her book, a whole list of things they should be doing differently. That's the way we should be checking what these people are doing. So long answer. You guys set it up this way, so now you're forced to listen to me babble on. But I do think that's what I would most like to see. Like, that would be my favorite thing to happen with the book. Is someone who cares about criminal justice reform would read it and say, yes, I'm going to make this part of my agenda.
So that's actually a great segue for what I was going to bring up next, which was prosecutors. I was listening this morning to an interview on the Justice in America podcast, which is excellent on this topic. An interview with Kim Foxx, who's the newly elected state attorney in Chicago, came in on a kind of reforming platform in a city which had her predecessor, Anita Alvarez, was much more kind of typical traditional law and order prosecutor. So Kim Foxx comes into office, and one of the things that she is talking about with great pride right now is trying to just publish data about what her office does. And so it was actually, she had a line which so fits perfectly with what you're arguing, Rachel, where she said on the podcast that, when she's no longer in office, they can go back to, treating minor shoplifting as a felony if they want, but she doesn't think they'll be able to go back on this move of sharing data because people will start to expect that level of transparency. And so if there's one kind of institutional reform she feels like she can have a lasting impact with, it's this one. I hope she's wrong about charging felonies for minor shoplifting, because she said it was also like the most charged crime in the Chicago system, so they're spending a lot of time and resources on it. But I thought that was just a really interesting point. And she, like you, thinks that there have to be new yardsticks for measuring how prosecutors are successful, and that the only way you can answer that question is to start publishing data about racial disparity, about what happens to a case from charging to conviction. And one thing I heard over and over again when I was reporting for my book relates also to a point you were just making, which is that prosecutors until now, and to a large degree I think judges also, their job is to do one case and then move on to another case. It's not to think, oh, all the breaking and entering cases I've done, what happened to those people? Like the guy who got a really good plea bargain and is out on a diversion program, is he doing better or worse than the person who went to prison? That's just not how they've been asked to think or analyze at all. And so I think one really strong argument for what you're arguing is that if you back up a step and ask people to take a kind of bird's eye view, we can change what we think is of value, because we'll be asking what the outcomes are, not just like, did this person who, the public and the media is sure is really dangerous get locked up forever? Because that's basically been the most salient feature, I think, for a lot of people who don't pay attention, meaning most people in the world, to these issues. But rather, are we preventing reoffending? Do we have a system in which, in the longer run, we're making communities healthier and better off, as opposed to just like lining people up and channeling them into jail and prison, from which, of course, they then come back home, and usually to the places they left, and usually less equipped to really contribute because of the stigma of being a felon, because of whatever else has happened to them in jail or prison. So anyway, that is a long way of saying, and I think you were touching on this earlier, but when you look at prosecutors right now, what challenges would you pose to them? And do you have ideas about how Kim Foxx should redefine a successful prosecutor, and how we all should be trying to measure the accomplishments and the performance of this particular group?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to think about how we have this really weird setup in criminal law where there's really almost no accountability for results and outcomes by anyone. So we don't sort of say, oh, is prosecution kind of promoting public safety on net, which policies are working and not. And it's not just true of prosecutors, it's really true kind of across the system. So you might think, oh, do we evaluate corrections programs and corrections officers to see what they're doing and whether or not when people come out, they're having better outcomes. And 95% of the people do come out of in their terms of incarceration. It's reported as if, we sent that person away, and there's no real thought of, they're going to come back again into society and re-enter society, and what have we done to make it so that that person is more likely to succeed when they do? So you might think we would measure those things, and we would ask those questions. And we don't. It's a kind of to me, it's just one of the craziest instances of, it's not a government program because no one sat down to program it. It's worse. It's just we have these series of isolated decisions that collectively amount to government activity in an area that is held to no accountability and to no review to see whether it's producing good results. So that's one of the reasons why I think this movement can actually take flight, because I think this is not a Democratic, Republican divide kind of issue. This is like for anybody. So anyone who thinks big, bloated government programs that don't work effectively, this should be priority one, where you look and say, this is terrible, and we should be getting better results, because we are not getting good public safety outcomes. And then for people who care about racial justice and how we're rebuilding communities, it's terrible at that too. It's just terrible across the board. So the question would be, how could you measure it in a better way or get better accountability to produce outcomes? So I think when you're thinking about what's a good prosecutor, who's a good prosecutor, instead of things like oh, how did that one high-profile case that was in the media for a while, how'd that turn out? I'm going to vote based on that one case. Really what we should be thinking about is, what has the office done to reduce incarceration? Now, I recognize if we were to do things like, because you can reduce incarceration without increasing crime rates. That's really important, and we know that. So you might think about, what are the ways in which that prosecutor has looked for ways to reduce incarceration, save those resources and dollars, use them for better things? What are they doing when it comes to the treatment of juveniles in their system? Again, getting people while they're younger could be treated better. What are they doing on pretrial detention? We know pretrial detention leads to more crimes later. Are they supporting the elimination of cash bail? Are they trying to eliminate pretrial detention? Basically taking the metrics of things that we know work and asking, where is my prosecutor on all those things? What is this person doing on those things that I know will ultimately lead to better public safety outcomes? And there's lots of people thinking about this. I know that Ann Milgram is out here somewhere. She's like the data queen, and thinks about what kinds of things should we be measuring, because what gets measured is what people will focus on within those offices. And so we do want to think about, what are we telling prosecutors matter and what they care about. Right now what we're saying is, you better get a really long sentence in that high-profile case that's on the front page of the paper for a while. But that can't be the measurement that we use if what we really want is to get, like you say, healthier communities and better public safety outcomes. And honestly, if we were to evaluate the system on that basis, and you could either use recidivism rates, which are controversial in some ways, because there's reason, desistance rates are people, they're recommitting crimes, but maybe they're lesser crimes. We could ask about employment or education outcomes. There's lots of different ways we could try to measure whether we're creating healthier communities and safer communities, but we're not doing any of that right now. The measurement really is these kind of long sentences in high-profile cases, but that's not really going to tell us anything. So my hope would be that we would demand real metrics that really reflect whether or not communities would be better off. And then we don't just do it for prosecutors, that we also think about the kinds of corrections programs we're offering, which are usually none. But the idea would be to think about the kinds of things where things would do better. And then I guess the last thing I will say, just about the first point you made about how Kim Foxx is hoping to introduce these institutional reforms that will kind of outlive her if she doesn't make it. That I just want to emphasize is really important. So when we get people in office who care about these kinds of things, that's the other kind of target population I have in mind, that they don't just kind of do the quick substantive change, because that can just be erased and undone when the next person comes in. It is much harder to undo a big institutional shift. So my lament, my regret with the Obama administration, which really wanted to do a lot of criminal justice reform, was a lot of the reform was that kind of thing that could be easily reversed, as opposed to the institutional changes. My hope was they create a new institutional structure for clemency, for example, that they would think about really putting a federal bench in place that was really going to be excellent for criminal justice issues. Those would be the kinds of things that would outlast any given president, as opposed to just, the things that are more ephemeral and could change from one person to the next.
So I think the last thing that we wanted to put on the table, and I think we may be at the time then to open it up for questions, depending on what the rules of this game are precisely.
Which we are making up as we go along.
Yeah.
Yes.
But
Someone will tell me.
But I want to talk about courts. So you kind of ended with, you made this point about the federal judiciary as an example of appointments as something that would outlast. And so I guess the first thing, a couple questions, but one is just sort of clarifying in terms of how you think about how judges as actors, and federal judges in particular for this part of the question, kind of fit into your story of sort of experts and insulation. So, because the one thing that I was struggling with in thinking about your account was, so judges are fully insulated, and they're not experts in the kind of agency experts that you analogize to, but they are experts to a degree, and so I sort of trying to figure out why were they so and you have this. I mean, you point to area after area after area where the judiciary within constraints right, chose the worst path, chose the most punitive path time and time again when they sort of had options in establishing doctrine. And part of me is wondering, why do we think that was so if we're going to be placing our faith in institutions that are insulated from politics, and it doesn't seem to have worked with this one, at least the way you tell the story, and it seems right to me. And then the other thing you talk about is you've got these numbers and you've reported them. You've been writing about this for a while, about the percentage of judges who have backgrounds in different areas, right? And 43% of federal judges are former prosecutors and 10% are former public defenders. And the Obama administration had roughly, the same numbers, slightly better, 14% public defenders or something instead of 10% public defenders. But definitely not the shift, that you were imagining. And so I feel like your message there at that point, well, it seems clear your message to sort of advocates is push on this issue, that this should be something that those of us that care about mass incarceration and reversing it and replacing it with a humane system should be focused on the appointments question much more than we have been. And then you have state courts, right, which is where most of the action is. 88% of prisoners are in state, county, and local prisons, not federal ones. And I was thinking that you were going to have an account there that sort of aligned with what's been happening with prosecutors. I was thinking, or I was curious if you have a vision where you're saying to this social movement, listen, the same energy that you're placing on prosecutors, you should start placing on judicial elections. And you've got a couple of lines on that. But then you go back to talking about federal judges, and so I wanted to know what came after that. What was going to come after those two lines about state court judges and elections and politics, and what message you have. What your analogous message that you have to the movement against mass incarceration regarding prosecutors. What are you telling that same movement about state court judicial elections in terms of what people should be asking for? Or is this an area that you don't want to have politicized further because of all of the politics of politicization?
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, and I'll do my best. So I will start with the last part, so I should say, if this was like first best solution, I don't really think we should elect prosecutors and judges in the United States. And I'll just put that out there because I think all of these pathologies are at their worst in that context. But I try to accept the world in which we live and what is feasible. And I don't think it's feasible to get rid of those elections. So then the next thing is, okay, then what? Then what do you do? So there's a reason there's only a couple lines on the state court. So that is like a kind of a call going forward. Yes, to the extent you care about electing prosecutors, we should be targeting who we elect as judges, because that matters tremendously. And in fact, I don't think we're going to see prosecutors succeeding, even these very progressive ones, unless they also have judges who see what they're doing and a vision to go along with it. I think we're seeing that in Philadelphia with Larry Krasner, where many judges have been resisting what he's wanted to do. That matters. It matters to have what happened in Houston in terms of bail reform. So it matters who sits on the bench. The reason there's not as much in the book, so that is going to be a law review article, and it is not in the book because it's actually it's complicated. Judicial elections are complicated. There was actually a really good Justice in America podcast about this actually recently that I highly recommend. And it's complicated because they're really big dollar elections at the highest court, and they're high dollar elections because frankly business interests care a lot about them. It matters for consumer interests and business interests. And so a really good illustration of why that matters, I think I can take from the Koch Foundation. So the Koch brothers have been fantastic on criminal justice reform, amazing. But they also have other goals as part of their foundation's framework, one of which is...
Yeah, we've heard.
Yes, so they have kind of a big libertarian framework, and one of them is deregulation, right? They really care about deregulation. So although the foundation is tremendous and supports criminal justice reform, the other Koch money will pay for candidates who run for high office at Supreme Court elections, who run ads that are the most retrograde, tough-on-crime ads you have ever seen, that go completely contrary to all the great progressive things the Koch Foundation is funding when it comes to criminal justice. You know, the ads, they're like, Judge Smith let this predator out on the playground on a technicality. There was a...
That's how you get your deregulatory judge in.
Right,
People
'cause-
don't vote for him.
Exactly, because he's not going to run on a platform that says, I love big business, and I'm going to rule every time for them when I take the bench. No, instead it's, I don't want the judge that's going to put the predator on the playground. So the fact that the Koch Foundation, I don't know whose that is. It's a catchy beat. I can try to work with it. The fact
Dancing
that...
was promised.
Yes, you did say you dance. That, I think, shows you the tension. So I think if we were going to get serious about state elections, we have to wrestle with that. And it's actually very complicated. And then it's complicated by the fact that you have elections for smaller courts in states too, not just their highest courts, but others. So that one, I think, was going to require way more detail. So it was just to get the idea out there. Wow, yes, you should care about this. But how you mobilize may require more strategy. Just like with prosecutors, there was a deliberate strategy. Which communities should we try to unseat an incumbent prosecutor? I think it's going to have to be strategic. Where does it matter the most? Is it these state high courts? Is there some other way we could think about getting a handle on this? So that's why it's kind of in a different spot, but I think it's critically important. For the federal bench, though, the other oddity in all this to me is that the framers anticipated pathological criminal processes and put a million checks in our, not a million, okay, a lot of checks in our Constitution to deal with it. They were really concerned about government overreach in criminal cases. It's in there. It's in our Constitution just waiting to be enforced the way that it should. Some of the stuff, we even have case law that makes it clear. You can't give those fines and fees. They are unconstitutional, but it's a question of when someone's too poor to pay. But it's a question of being able to get litigators out there actually bringing the actions, getting people to do it, and judges who recognize it. So I think that the federal bench is critical, and that's why it's also easier, because we don't have to think about elections. You're just electing one person, the president, and thinking about what should be the agenda of that president on criminal justice reform. So the example I'll give you on that one, and this is, people looked at me like I was crazy. So the seat opens up for Justice Scalia, and, people are talking about who it's going to be, and there's the short list, and it's, these very, very well qualified, excellent jurists, and I don't want to suggest that they're not. But when people asked me, I said Bryan Stevenson. He's an outstanding Supreme Court advocate. There's not a better lawyer in the United States. He's been working in the trenches on civil rights and criminal justice. Like, that's our person. That should be our person. So when the name was Merrick Garland, I was like, I'm not saying he's not smart and he's not excellent. He is, but he fits a mold, which is the mold we've been getting repeatedly. And I think it's really important to step outside that and ask, why not Bryan Stevenson for that? He probably doesn't want it, I don't know. But why not somebody like that? And why not lawyers like that on the bench generally? People who are working on civil rights, people who are doing public interest, people who've done public defense, that whole range of experiences. Why is it so many former prosecutors who are also excellent? I still want them on the bench, I'm not saying, but the balance is quite out of whack. And I think if we had a bench that was more diverse professionally, you would get different outcomes when we have appellate courts sitting in panels and they listen to each other and they made decisions. And that would be federal constitutional law that would apply everywhere and would, I think, make a really big difference. So the other call to action that I hope is out there for people who are reforming is when you have presidential appointments, I think people in the criminal justice community that care about these issues should be just as vocal as we see other interest groups are when their issues are on the table. Labor interests, abortion rights, those interests mobilize and they really say, wow, who's the person who's going to be on the bench? Because I know it's going to matter to me. Well, it's also going to matter for criminal justice. And I think for too long, people haven't thought of it that way. And so one of the reasons I focused on the federal system here is to get that shift, because that one's more doable more quickly without thinking about these electoral dynamics.
Can I just say very quickly before turning it over to Emily that it seems like one of the purposes of these, this an early talk like this is to help you think about the launching of your book more generally. And it seems to me that we have just arrived at what is both on the merits and also from a PR hook. All your future book events are why Bryan Stevenson should be on the Supreme Court.
And then how
Like,
might
and
the
we're
politics
done,
of
and
that
like we're
appointment-
done, right? Like we're done.
And then you can run the play. It didn't work out very well for Merrick Garland. Like maybe the same kind of social movement forces that James was talking about earlier would have changed that whole dynamic, right? Imagine a world in which people around the country were really galvanized by that appointment, which was not the one we lived in.
Yes. Yes, I don't know if I'm supposed to respond to that. The PR part is not really natural to me, so I'm going to take advice from the two of you. So, do you guys have more questions for me? Should
I think we should.
Yeah.
Is there time to have?
I think
any
so. I don't
questions from-
see Penelope somewhere telling me what times are things, but I think we could do 10, 15 minutes of questions if people have them.
That seems great.
Okay.
I'm going to call on Issa because I know her.
I'm glad you're talking about the Koch bros. So my question relates to that, which is, what is your thought about this alliance between the right and the left in criminal justice reform? And in your comments, it seemed to me that the place where we break, of course, is on welfare policy. And I mean on European sense, like a genuine, real welfare state. And that seems relevant for two of the things that you seem really concerned about. One, it seems that all the relationships that we know between certain criminal justice policies and outcomes only obtain under given, socioeconomic conditions that we have right now. There's no reason to think that, for example, pretrial detention is going to have the same relationship to desistance if we have the economic conditions of the late 1970s. And so there's that, and so we're going to have radically different economic conditions. What we know about the sort of causal relationships between two things would obtain. And the second, of course, the politics aren't going to necessarily align. So I guess I'm really curious about what you think about, how to go along with that, how to manage that. What do you think about that alliance?
So I think, to borrow something from James's book, when we had various communities and, communities of color, when they were dealing with various problems in their around them, as James pointed out, they asked for a lot of different things. One was better policing, but there were all these requests for more social programs and education and employment, what he calls, all of the above. And then they just get the criminal justice response. And I think, you're right to ask that same question, which is that's really a good investment if we want to have public safety, is to invest in those kinds of things. I will, just as I didn't tackle could we do away with elections for prosecutors and judges, I didn't tackle the whole how we view the welfare state and how we view programs. So the aim here was the more modest one, to say, let's at least not have our criminal justice policies make things worse. So let's, at least in the corner of the world that criminal justice operates in, let's get those right. We won't maximize public safety without getting the other things right, but at a minimum, we could do some serious damage control by at least getting rid of the really bad criminal justice policies that are out there. But I don't want to suggest that alone that would solve things. I do think, though, that there's a way in which setting up some of these things could help address those other issues. So if it turns out that you could create kind of justice reinvestment models where the money you save on incarceration goes into programming, whether it's educational programming or vocational training, and you had an agency that kind of had that pot of cash and thought about where to spend it, the data would show that's where it would be best spent. And so I think once you start doing that, the case would be made, I would hope, to do more of it. And this goes back to Emily's point with the district attorney in Chicago, that it's not just that she's going to be creating the data, but the data makes a case for itself as time goes on. So to the extent we can get these little footholds on these things, you start to have evidence that this stuff works and it's a good investment, and that actually does matter and has helped. I give you one example, which is when the Sentencing Commission lowered all the sentences for people who were serving crack offenses. This was before they changed the federal crack mandatory minimum laws. There was room to change the guidelines. And when they reduced them, they were able to measure what happened to the people who got those reductions. What did their recidivism rates look like as compared to the people who had to serve their full sentence? And what the commission found was that there was no increase in recidivism when you gave people the shorter sentences. Well, fast forward to the point when the commission is deciding, wow, should we lower all drug sentences? Like, the most important fact that was out there in the world was, yes, because look, you did this for crack sentences and it was fine. And now you could do it for all drugs. And now fast forward again, when Congress is considering the First Step Act, they looked at the data from the Sentencing Commission lowering drug sentences and thought, oh, okay, actually, we could do more retroactive relief for crack sentences again. So the data builds a case for itself, and my hope would be if you set these institutions up right, some of that data would be about social programs, and that would then make the case for more of it. But I want to be super modest here in saying that, like, I don't know how to tackle that. I really don't know how to get at that bigger picture, but I do think criminal justice in its own sphere can do a better job.
Yes, gentlemen, yes.
I was thinking about the other Bazelon's terrific op-ed piece on Senator Harris. And it seems to me it's landed with a thud. To the extent that she portrays herself as a progressive, it's devastating. She could have been a Republican prosecutor in freaking California and had the same policies. So the question is, do you think that's going to hurt her in the general election, or even the primaries, or help her? Because clearly it hasn't resonated, as proposed Rachel's thesis, as something that it appears the body politic cares about that much.
So I don't know if you guys want to take a dive on this. I'll say this
You're
much.
booked up.
Yeah, I know. So you know, it matters to me, and it matters to a lot of other people who work on criminal justice reform issues, that record. And what in particular was something that sparked a real concern was to characterize that record as progressive. So it would be one thing to say, I made some decisions in the past, and now knowing what I know now, I wouldn't have done them. I want to pivot to other things. What most concerns me is the characterization of that as progressive. So I do think that is of concern to me, someone who votes and cares about those issues. Your question, though, is how many people are out there that care about those things? You know, and this goes to James's point about what is this social movement and what does it focus on? You know, it cares about a lot of things, and picking a presidential candidate is about a lot of things. And that will be high on the agenda for some people, but maybe not as high for others. And so I guess I would say for the people who care about criminal justice reform, one of the things that has to be done is to kind of keep that issue front and center and ask questions about it and make it an issue. It will matter, I think, in this sense that we did see in the previous election, there was a shift in terms of the way Hillary Clinton, for example, talked about criminal justice policies, because there were a lot of grassroots activists who met with her and were really calling her to task for positions she had taken in the past. So I don't see a reason why that wouldn't replicate itself. It's a big Democratic primary, huge Democratic primary field right now, with many people that have records that we could ask questions about. Former prosecutors or people involved with if Joe Biden enters the race, will question his role in many of the laws from the 1980s that were quite harsh. So I suspect this will be an issue. But it'll be more of an issue in the primary, I think, than it would be in the general election. And even in the primary, it'll be a question of, you know, kind of how it plays against other kinds of things.
Yes.
You talked about this a little bit earlier, that there's always going to be a conversation in the public opinion about new issues that come up, so there'll always be this kind of disconnect between this moment we're in of moving towards a more progressive view on criminal justice and areas where we want more criminal accountability. And I think we see that now in different areas, particularly with the opioid crisis, but also, I think, sexual crimes as well as accountability for police. And so we have I think it's an interesting opportunity, at least in my mind, that we can be forward-looking. And how do we deal with these issues that we perceive as being a problem? And maybe they aren't, maybe the data says otherwise, but at least there's social movements that see them as problems, and that we want to address them. And, you know, instead of having this kind of retroactive view of criminal justice reform, having this forward view, now we're going to tackle it. How do we do so knowing the current state of our criminal justice system and trying to avoid similar institutional issues going forward?
So I think it's a great point about kind of what are the things that we care about. It does go to how we measure prosecutors, for example, what things we're looking at. So I think we have in this country an under-enforcement problem when it comes to certain kinds of criminal behaviors and an over-enforcement problem when it comes to others. And one of the reasons things are out of whack depends upon kind of how we're measuring the people who are responsible for enforcing those laws. So to give you an example of something I have in mind, so in Baltimore, right now, the prosecutor has said, I don't really want to waste my time on marijuana possession cases, but the police are still that we're going to keep arresting them. Baltimore has a very low clearance rate for crimes of violence. And so one might ask, is that really the best way to deploy policing resources on these offenses, particularly if your prosecutor's not going to bring them? And so, today I saw the billboard that was taken out by residents of Baltimore to try to call attention to, please don't do this, don't focus on the pot possessors, focus on crimes of violence that aren't solved. And so I think your question gets at that issue of if we were to really ask ourselves what we would like to see out of law enforcement, it would require us to prioritize certain kinds of enforcement policies versus others. And so we might think about what kind of data do we focus on. If we're just focusing on, kind of total number of charges or total number of arrests, that might lead towards certain behaviors on the part of police and prosecutors that get to lower level things and not as much attention to the things that are more serious that may require more resources but would only yield maybe one conviction, or there's fewer of them, or they're harder to solve. And so I think if we had a concern that our resources are limited, how we want to allocate them would allow us, I think, to have the conversation that you're talking about. In a world of limited resources, where are they best spent, and how can we think about that? And then I think the other way to think about it is making sure that we allocate them the right way, but by also paying attention to what will actually work to reduce even those kinds of crimes. What's the best strategy for those? And there, I think, again, long sentences, when people come back out from prison, it's very difficult to reintegrate and to re-enter a community. And so although the thought might be longer sentences for some of those things, it may be better to think about what if we get better, whatever programming we can find that works. And there are some things that work that we could offer while people are incarcerated. So getting a more balanced assessment of what, targeting the things we want to target on, and then what's the right punishment or approach to those things. And for some of those things, and this is going to go back to Issa's question, not everything is best addressed with criminal justice solutions. There are some things that, if we're thinking about, we might want that as part of it, but there may be a bigger picture involved when we're thinking about sexual violence, police use of force. There's other kinds of norms adjustment we could have in other ways. So making it part of that bigger sense. But I agree with you. I think it's one of the things that's so awful, and it's almost universally awful about criminal justice in the United States, is we at the same time have both of those problems, both under enforcement and over enforcement. And in both areas we see racial discrimination associated with it. And I think one of the reasons we get that is because we have poor accountability measures for the things that should really matter. What do you guys think? We have
One
time
more
for?
question?
I think so. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
I want to take a pulse at the poke further bubble one more time, if that's okay with you. Rachel knows that I'm sending Rogers the decarceration movement like a hawk. And I can tell you that the three states that are far and away in the forefront of the proportional percentage drop in their population are New York, New Jersey, and California. And the elements there have to do, at one level, in terms of what does it take. Believe me, it wasn't bipartisanship, or the Koch brothers. It was popular movement, litigation, not so much in New York, but in both in New Jersey and in California. And then in California, on top of that, ballot measures, which are a great indicator of popular opinion. At another level, I think the lesson there has to do with the larger context for reforms. I mean, if you look at what's happened in New York compared to, the paragon of bipartisan state-level reform in Texas, it's almost night and day. And of course, the most visible bipartisan effort is what brought us the latest reform at the federal level, and it was nothing to write home about. And many of the popular movements couldn't even get behind it. I think the bigger context, though, or the bigger lesson, may have something to do, and I'd like to hear your thoughts, about, I mean, mass incarceration is a cultural pathology. And it's easy, we shouldn't miss the fact that those are some of the very bluest states in the country. They're states where the political economy and the political culture is very much shifted. Bipartisanship at both the federal and the state level seems to me to have impeded more vigorous reform.
So I guess a couple thoughts on that one. So first, I do think in California, the key driver there was the Supreme Court decision that required them to think about realignment. And so we just actually had a talk about the ballot initiative process and whether it's on net good or bad. I'm firmly in the bad camp, and we can talk more about that afterwards. Because I do think the bigger push there was the Supreme Court decision in the Plata case. In terms of thinking about the reductions in places like, certainly it's going to matter who's pushing for criminal justice reform. And so the more people you have that are vigorously for it, the better. And that may be associated in bluer states at times. But I do think there is an opportunity for these kinds of structural reforms that are about getting better accountability and getting better results, saving money, making so I think there's a case to be made. I agree with you. We have mass incarceration in the United States, and really almost any of our states would be outliers in the world. But we do have geographic variation, as your question points out. And it's probably not going to be a surprise if you look at a lot of the southern states. They have higher incarceration rates. You can kind of trace what you might imagine exists. But it's also the case that even in very red states, there is still, even there, some push towards getting criminal justice reform. And it goes back to James's point of, once you have the push, what do you do with it? What do you ask for? And I guess what I would like to see is, whether there's someone on the left, someone on the right, whatever it is, whoever cares about it, to ask for the kinds of things here that I think will produce better public safety. Because I guess if I gave you one takeaway, and since this was the last question, I'll say it here, the key thing I want to emphasize about the book is, I would like us to have better public safety outcomes. This isn't one of these books that's like, oh, we just need to, have a happier world. And these are actually things that not only treat people with better respect and dignity and reduce discrimination, they improve public safety. So it's the weird public policy space where we have a win-win out there to get better safety outcomes. And so I think it's just a question of educating the people who push for those things to see it. So I rarely end on optimistic notes, but I could end on that one. And thank you all again for coming. And I think I can sign books. Okay.